Notching and boring or drilling of studs or floor joists, structural components, or even non-structural for like non-bearing stud walls. There are regulations for that in the code book, and I'm sure if you have an existing house and you've gone in and looked at your floor system, if your basement's unfinished, you've seen all kinds of holes, or maybe some stuff that you said like, man, I don't know if that thing actually will hold up the weight that I want to put on it. And so I want to make sure to touch base on that. I've gotten a lot of questions from homeowners over time as an inspector, asking me, where can I drill holes? How big can they be? Where should I put them? And so I'm going to touch on studs, walls, interior or exterior bearing walls, interior walls, non-bearing, and then I'll dive into floor joists. And so first we'll go kind of through the code, we'll look at some diagrams, and then I'll show you a few pictures that I found that might kind of give you a little bit of an idea what I'm talking about. So let's start off with walls, and we'll dive into the code a little bit here. So drilling and notching of studs. Okay, so drilling and notching of studs shall be in accordance with the following. So talking about just notching right here. So any stud in an exterior wall or bearing partition. So it could be an interior bearing wall or an exterior wall, which would end up being bearing. So either holding the roof or holding the floor or both, right? Shall be permitted to be cut or notched to a depth not exceeding 25% of its width. Okay, so obviously if it was, well, 2x4s are only 3.5 inches, but for the sake of math, if it was an actual 4-inch stud, you can only go 25%, that's 1 inch. So you can notch the side of it up to 1 inch. It'd be less than that, probably like 3/4 of an inch for an actual 2x4, right? Studs in non-bearing partitions shall be permitted to be notched to a depth not to exceed 40% of a single stud width. So you can go a little bit more, okay? So if you're back to that, 4-inch stud, 40%, well, it'd be a little less than 2 inches, okay? So just kind of keep in mind notching, okay? So this is in a stud wall, so it's vertical. When you get in a floor joist, it's a little bit different. So now we're talking about drilling. Drilling, any stud shall be permitted to be bored or drilled, provided that the diameter of the resulting hole is not more than 60% of the stud width, okay? The edge of the hole is not more than 5/8 of an inch to the edge. So even if you, like if it's a 2x4, you have to have 5/8 on either side. Well, what is that? That's what, inch and a quarter? Okay, so 1.25 inches out of a 2x4 is going to leave you what, like 2.5, like 2.25. But then it's telling you can only go 60%. All right, so half of 3.5 would be 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches. So you could go, yeah, probably right there, probably right in that 2 inch if you were like dead on, right? It says to the edge of the stud, the hole is not located in the same section as a cut or a notch, right? Which you wouldn't be able to meet that requirement if it was a 2x4, 2x6 maybe. Studs located on exterior walls or bearing partitions drilled over 40% and up to 60% shall be doubled with not more than 2 successive doubled studs bored. So you'd only be able to do that in like one location. Maybe you've got a maybe like a kitchen sink and you got a window above it, and so you got a vent for plumbing, and your kitchen sink vent needs to go up and out through the roof. But it can't go through where the window is, so you have to turn in the wall and go through like some double up studs, and you need to make sure that you meet your boring requirements, and maybe you got to add extra studs in there to meet that requirement. It says use of approved stud shoes is permitted. Move myself out of the way here. Use of approved stud shoes is permitted where they are installed in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations. So if you've got something that just got beat up, or maybe you have an existing situation in your house, you pull open some drywall, you're doing some remodel work, and you're like, oh my gosh, these things have just been beat up. Well, you might get some stud shoes or collars. What they might call them is like a pipe collar, and it's just, and I'll show you a picture, but it's just like a metal collar that goes over the stud, and it has like a cutout for the pipe, so it goes around that pipe and it just gets nailed off and kind of gives it some extra support. Drilling and notching of the top plate. So it says where piping or ductwork is placed in or partially in an exterior wall or interior load-bearing wall, necessitating cutting or notching of the top plate by more than 50% of its width, a galvanized metal tie, not less than, saying, 0.054 inch thick and 1.5 inch wide, shall be fastened across the plate at each side of the opening. So what does that mean? That just means that if you are running again, maybe it's a plumbing pipe, maybe you've got a 2x6 wall and you've got your dryer duct goes up through that, and that's 4 inches. And so you're notching out a huge chunk of that. They're going to ask you to put a metal strap across there. So one, it's going to protect against screws, drywall screws going in there, and it's going to keep that top plate pulled together. That's pretty easy, and you can find those straps just about anywhere. So notching and boring hole limitations for exterior wall and bearing walls. So any bearing wall, any exterior wall. So here they're kind of talking about, here's your bore holes, max diameter 40% of stud depth, 5/8 inch minimum to the edge. Notch must not exceed 25%, right? Bore holes shall not be located in the same cross section of cut or notched, right? So you can't have a hole and a notch in the same spot. Okay, if hole is between 40 and 60% of the stud depth, then the stud must be doubled. So here they've doubled it up, and then here they've doubled it up. The stud must no more than 2 successive studs are doubled and so bored. Here's your 5/8 again. So that's kind of just a quick little rundown on notching and boring, right? They're not telling you where you have to notch and bore it. They're just saying it can only meet these, must meet these maximum sizes and, minimum distance from the edge, right? 5/8 from the edge. What about interior? So we dive in here to interior. Blow this one up here so it's much more visible. So notching and boring for interior non-bearing walls. So same thing, max hole or bored hole max diameter 60%, 5/8 inch again. Notch must not exceed 40%. So we're talking about notching versus boring. You can't have the notch and the bore at the same spot. So pretty straightforward on that. Even though it's non-bearing, they don't want you to cut it into nothing. Here's that top plate we talked about, where you're going to want to run this strap across. You're going to protect your pipe for one, and you're going to kind of pull this top plate together. That's that kind of covers notching and boring for stud walls. Pretty straightforward. I'll show you a picture once I go through floor joists and kind of show you what that collar looks like. So you can put that in if you have run into an existing situation, or maybe you forgot to put in a 2x6 wall and you just got a whole bunch of plumbing going through it and you're like, what do I do? I've inspected some situations like that, and we've put in those collar ties and just kind of pulled everything together, and it was okay. So if you run into that situation, I'll show you a collar tie here a little bit later. But let's dive into now floor joists, because those are a little bit different. Studs are just up and down, but floors are spanning, right? And so depending on where you put things, you don't want to kind of mess up with the deflection of those joists. Okay, so we have cutting, drilling, and notching. So structural floor members shall not be cut, bored, or notched in excess of the limitation specified. So sawn lumber, so we have notches in solid lumber joists. Rafters and beams shall not exceed 1/6 of the depth of the member, right? Okay, so not 1/6. So 1/6 of, well, 1/6 of a 2x6, right, would be 1 inch almost, probably a little less than that since you're 5.5. So you couldn't notch more than an inch, say 3/4 of an inch in a 2x6. So if you get up to like a 2x10, you're 9.5 inches. You're going to get up a little bit more over that inch, right? Maybe 1.5 inches, somewhere in there without doing the actual math. And shall not be longer than 1/3 of the depth. So longer than 1/3 of the depth. So 1/3 of a 9-inch, 9.5 inch 2x10, well, 1/3 is 3 inches. So you could do a notch, say 1.5 inches by 3 inches if you had a 2x10. That's kind of what it's telling you there. Notches at ends of members shall not exceed 1/4 of the depth of the member. So sometimes they notch the very ends. let's see here, the tension sides of members 4 inches or greater in nominal thickness shall not be notched except at the ends of the members. The diameter of holes bored or cut into members. So now we talked a little about notching. Now we're talking about drilling holes, right? Maybe you got electrical wires, maybe you got plumbing, maybe you got a little duct you got to run through there. The diameter of holes bored or cut into members shall not exceed 1/3 the depth of the member. So again, the depth and 1/3, so 2 by 10, would be just a tinch over 3 inches, right? 1/3. And it says holes shall not be closer than 2 inches to the top or bottom of the member. So if you have a 2 by 10, it's telling you can go a little over 3 inches, but you have to have at least 2 inches of separation from the bottom and 2 from the top. So that's, if you did a 3-inch hole and 2 and 2, well then that's 7 inches. So out of a 9.5 inch, you got a little bit of room to play there, but you're almost going to have to be dead center. Okay, but you could run a 2-inch plumbing vent or something through there, and you would have no problems. You could even run a 3-inch toilet through there, toilet line, and you could make it work in a 2 by 10. It says holes shall not be closer than 2 inches to the top or bottom of the member or any other hole located in the member, so they can't be right next to each other. Where the member is notched, the hole shall not be closer than 2 inches to the notch. So again, you're just staying kind of 2 inches from everything. Engineered wood products, so we're talking about I-joists. And if you've got I-joist, you're going to install that per the manufacturer's installation instructions. See, they're telling you that cut notches, holes, trusses, structural composite lumber. This is going to say, or I-joists. So all those components that are like manufactured products are going to be prohibited except where permitted by the manufacturer's recommendations. Okay, so that's not just I-joist, that's like glue-lam beams. That would be like engineered trusses. Don't ever cut or notch a truss, okay? I've had people learn that the hard way. They go cut and notch it, messes up the entire engineering on it, and then they have to go get fixes for it. Same with glue lams, right? Glue lams, they're going to tell you exactly where you can and can't drill holes. The whole thing as itself has been designed to span the distance that it is. And if you start drilling holes into it, it can mess it all up. I've had instances where it's no fun and we have to figure out ways to get some type of documentation showing us that it's okay, or we've had to swap it out or change it or add to it, and it just becomes a pain. So it just kind of in a nutshell, don't drill or notch into any manufacturer products unless you specifically know that you can do it. I-joists, like floor system I-joist, usually they have knockouts in them. You can actually see where they've stamped it as a knockout. You pop it with your hammer and it pops right out. Those are typically no problem. It's when you get into beams and trusses and stuff like that it can be a problem. So now we're talking about back to dimensional lumber, not like an engineered product, but this is kind of, your 2 by 10s, 2 by 8s, 2 by 12s. And so here they're kind of talking about, let me blow this up. So here they're showing you notching and boring, right? So here's notching, and then of the notching, they're telling you that you can have no notches permitted in the center third. You can only do it on the outside thirds. So if you've got a 15-foot joist, right, you break that into thirds, 5, 5, and 5. The center 5 feet, you can't do any notches and no boring, right? That's a huge point for deflection, and they want to make sure they have all the structural integrity they can get. And just kind of like I explained, you can go 1/6 the depth for your notch and 1/3 of the depth for the width, and you can be inside the outside thirds, okay? And here they're talking about actually notching the joist so that it sits on top of the top plate. They're telling you can go diameter divided by 4, right? So 1/4 of the depth. So 1/4 of 8 inches would be 2 inches, right? So you go a little over 2-inch depth on a 2 by 10. It's 9.5 inches. Now we get into the boring. So 2-inch minimum from the top and bottom of the joist. And they're telling you that you need to be diameter divided by 3. So pretty straightforward. That kind of covers the basis on notching and boring for floor joists and for stud walls. I do have a few pictures that I kind of found, and I'll show them to you. right here. Let's hop over there and look at those. These will be a little blurry, but you can see right here they have a 2-inch line that they're trying to run through a 2x4. And you can see how, depending on how things lay out, they ended up cutting the whole side of this. This is not 5/8. You might have 5/8 right there. Doesn't look like they have it there, and they're obviously all broke up right there. So something would have to be done to protect that, right? Even if it's non-bearing, they're asking you to put in a collar or something like that. And your inspector might tell you otherwise if it's non-bearing, but to cover yourself, you might put in, here would be a collar, okay? So you can see, like, if you had a pipe and that whole thing was broken out, you just shove this over the top of it, you would nail it. So nail on the top of the stud, bottom of the stud, and the pipe would go right through it. And it just kind of pulls everything together. And you'd install that per the install instructions of the collar, which might require a specific fastener, probably not like deck screws. It might be like some type of nail or something like that. A Tico nail, I think, is what we see a lot around here. That might just be like a brand name word, but you know, make sure that you get the proper type of nail or screw if that's what you're doing. And here you can see they've notched an I-joist, right? So this is a manufactured, engineered product, and they've notched it. So they've messed with the integrity of the specific joist. What do guys do most of the time? They do one of two things. They head it out, or they have to sister another one right next to it. And so this kind of particular picture is no fun. I'll blow it up. You can see they've already put like 1x up here for some reason. Maybe just to add an airspace for sound or something like that. It's like, well, you're going to have to head this out, or you would have had to add a whole second joist spanning end to end, right? So you'd have to take all these 1x's down if you wanted to carry it end to end to add back in the structural support, because this thing's been cut. So don't cut or notch your I-joists. Only do it per the installation instructions, the manufacturer requirements. I've seen this happens a lot in new houses. You know, a toilet has to go where a toilet has to go. I get that. Tub has to go where a tub has to go. And so if the framers don't lay it out properly, you get stuck with a situation like this. And it's not the end of the world. You just head it out or add another one to it and move on. But just make sure you're aware of it. So if you have to head it out, it might look something like this. Right? I kind of showed you back in the floor framing diagram, kind of how heading it out and talking about those types of situations. But you can see they used hangers. They doubled up the joists, and then they doubled up the header, right? It's a beam. Essentially created a beam that is then going to hold the load of this other joist and transfer it over to these, which is why they doubled those up. Let's see, just another picture of like an existing situation. You might open up your walls, and then this is what you have. And you're like, oh, that doesn't look very structurally sound. You know, if it's been there for however many years. I just ask people, you know, to do the best they can. As an inspector, it's like, you know, maybe you could add some collars on here. Maybe you could add another stud in here if they're tearing this out and redoing it. It's like, hey, let's add a couple studs. Let's just bring back the structural integrity of it and try to make it cleaner and more sound. So you do the best you can. Existing situations are existing, and unless it is like severely safety hazard, then, you know, at least myself as an inspector, we're allowed to leave it. It's existing. But if it's a safety problem, like, man, this whole wall is going to give, then we would ask you to do something with it. So that should cover notching and boring for studs and for floor joists. And just keep that in mind as you're working through your project. And even if you looked at this and you're like, oh, I'm looking at my existing floor system and there's holes all over the place and they're notched everywhere, well, you at least now know, like, well, maybe it doesn't meet today's code. It's existing, so I can leave it. But if I'm able, maybe I would add some more support in there and make it a little stronger for the future.